Nora Bennett paid $5,000 for a farm nobody else wanted at the county auction. Cracked dirt, dead crops. Everyone said she'd been fooled. Her late father used to talk about water running deep beneath that land, but nobody ever took him seriously. Then a drought hit the whole county. Wells started running dry everywhere else, and one morning a line of unfamiliar trucks pulled onto her property, asking questions nobody expected. Nora Bennett was 34 years old, the day she paid $5,000 for a farm nobody else in the county wanted. And if you've ever bet everything you had left on something everyone told you was a mistake, stick with us tonight and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Nora had lost her job at a regional accounting firm 8 months earlier during a round of layoffs nobody saw coming, and the divorce that followed not long after had taken most of what savings she'd managed to keep separate, leaving her with considerably less to work with than she'd had at any point in her adult life. When she saw the notice for a county tax auction listing a 40-acre property out past the old highway, land that had sat abandoned for going on 6 years after the previous owner defaulted, she drove out to see it, mostly out of curiosity, not expecting to actually bid on anything that day. The property, once she walked it, looked exactly as rough as its listing history suggested. Cracked, dry soil stretched across most of the acreage. The old farmhouse sat with a partially collapsed porch and broken windows, and whatever crops had once grown there had clearly failed years before anyone stopped trying. Still, something about the empty quiet of the place settled into Nora in a way she hadn't expected, and when the county auctioneer opened bidding at an almost embarrassingly low starting price, she found herself raising her hand before she'd fully thought through what she was agreeing to take on. She won the property for $5,000, a number that felt both absurdly cheap for 40 acres of land and, given her actual bank balance that month, still an uncomfortable stretch to manage. Grady Tolliver, a long-time local farmer who'd bid half-heartedly against her before dropping out early, caught up with her afterward in the parking lot and told her plainly, without much tact, that she'd just bought the most cursed piece of dirt in the whole county, land that had broken 2 families before her and wasn't likely to treat a third any kinder. Nora thanked him for his opinion and didn't argue the point, mostly because she didn't have a confident counter-argument ready yet. Moving in that following month confirmed most of what Grady had implied. The well on the property ran weak and inconsistent. The soil tested poor for almost anything beyond the hardiest weeds, and neighbors she met over those first few weeks mostly regarded her with the polite, distant sympathy people reserve for someone they assume has made a costly, foolish decision. Nora spent those early weeks doing basic repairs on the farmhouse roof and plumbing, telling herself the land itself was a problem for later, once she'd at least made the house livable enough to think clearly in. It was clearing out a back closet in the farmhouse, left mostly untouched by the previous owners, that Nora found a small wooden box tucked behind a water heater, containing old photographs and a leather-bound journal that, based on the names scrawled inside the front cover, had belonged to someone entirely unconnected to the property's recent history. Confused, she did some digging through county records the following day and discovered that this particular journal had belonged to her own father, Walt Bennett, who had, decades earlier, briefly owned a neighboring parcel of land before selling it off when Nora was still a small child, a piece of family history she'd never heard him discuss in any real detail while he was alive. Sitting on her half-repaired porch that evening, flipping through her father's handwriting for the first time in the 11 years since his death, Nora found herself unexpectedly emotional, missing a man she'd always found somewhat difficult to fully understand while he was alive. Near the back of the journal, dated only a few years before he'd sold that neighboring parcel, was an entry that stopped her cold reading it in the fading evening light. Walt had written, in his familiar blocky handwriting, that everybody in the county judged this land by what grew on top of it, when the only thing that actually mattered sat far beneath the surface, running deep and cold and completely invisible to anyone who never bothered looking further than the cracked dirt everybody else saw. Nora read the passage twice. Sitting on that broken porch surrounded by 40 acres of land, 3 separate families had apparently failed to make anything of, wondering whether her father had actually known something specific about this ground, or whether grief and a very long, discouraging day were simply making her look for hidden meaning in an old man's cryptic, half-finished thought, one he'd never once mentioned to her directly in all the years she'd known him. Walt Bennett had been a quiet, difficult man by most accounts, including Nora's own memory of him, someone who worked various land surveying and well drilling jobs around the county over the years without ever settling into one steady career for long. Nora's mother had mentioned once, years after Walt's death, that he'd owned a small parcel out past the old highway, sometime before Nora was born, sold it off quickly, for reasons he never fully explained, and rarely brought the subject up again afterward. Reading his journal now, Nora began piecing together a version of her father she'd never known while he was alive. Someone who apparently spent considerable time studying groundwater patterns and old surveying maps as a personal interest that went well beyond his actual paid work. Over the following weeks, settling further into the farmhouse and the daily grind of basic repairs, Nora started noticing small details about the property that didn't entirely match the uniformly hopeless picture Grady Tolliver and her other new neighbors had painted for her. One section of the back acreage, despite the ongoing dry spell gripping the whole county that summer, stayed a shade greener than everywhere else. Low, scrubby vegetation surviving where it had no obvious business surviving at all. An old stone-lined spring near the property's eastern edge, marked on an ancient plat map she found folded into her father's journal, still produced a thin, steady trickle of water, even during weeks when the rest of the county reported wells running unusually low. Nora mentioned these small oddities to her sister, Callie, during one of their weekly phone calls, half joking about her dead father's mysterious groundwater obsession and the strange green patch that refused to die, along with everything else on the property. Callie, practical in the way she'd always been, told Nora plainly that she was reading far too much into a stubborn patch of weeds and one old spring that probably just sat slightly lower in elevation than the surrounding land, catching whatever rain did fall more efficiently than everywhere else. She suggested, not unkindly, that Nora consider cutting her losses entirely, selling the property to a developer or land investor for whatever scrap value it might bring, rather than continuing to sink money and time into 40 acres that had already broken 2 families before her. Nora considered Callie's advice seriously enough to actually call a land investor that same week, getting a rough valuation that came back barely above what she'd originally paid at auction, a number that made selling feel less like cutting her losses and more like accepting she'd wasted months of work for almost nothing in return. She hung up that call more frustrated than reassured, and found herself instead pulling her father's journal back out that same evening, reading through his groundwater notes more carefully this time, trying to understand exactly what surveying knowledge he'd actually possessed that might explain his confidence about what sat beneath this particular stretch of ground. The Regional Weather Office issued its first serious drought advisory of the season in early July, warning that reservoir levels and groundwater tables across the county had dropped further than any point in recent memory, with no meaningful rain forecast for weeks to come. Nora felt the advisory mostly as background noise at first, one more piece of bad news in a summer that had already delivered plenty, until reports started filtering through the local grapevine about actual wells failing on farms she recognized by name, properties considerably better maintained and more established than her own struggling 40 acres. Grady Tolliver's own well, according to a conversation Nora overheard at the feed store one afternoon, had dropped to barely a trickle that week, forcing him to haul water in from town for his cattle at real expense he clearly hadn't budgeted for. 2 other farms further down the county road reported similar trouble within days of each other, wells that had run reliably for decades, suddenly producing next to nothing as the drought tightened its grip on the whole region. Even the municipal system serving the small town nearby had reportedly started rationing water for its residents, a measure nobody there could remember happening in living memory. Nora walked out to her own eastern spring that same evening, the one her father's old plat map had marked so carefully decades earlier, and found it running exactly as steady as it had all summer, seemingly untouched by whatever was happening to every other water source in the county around her. Standing at that spring with the whole county's water troubles spreading around her, Nora made a decision she couldn't entirely justify financially, calling a hydrological survey firm out of the regional city 2 hours away and paying for a full groundwater assessment of her property, a cost that ate through nearly the last of her remaining savings. She told herself it was simple curiosity, a way of finally settling the question her father's journal had raised months earlier, though some quieter part of her recognized she was hoping for considerably more than an answer to an old man's cryptic note. The survey team spent 3 days on the property, running equipment across the acreage that measured things Nora didn't fully understand, even as she watched them work, moving slowly across the back pasture and the area near the eastern spring, with instruments that beeped and printed out readings on rolls of paper Nora couldn't begin to interpret herself. It was nearly a week later that the lead hydrologist, a measured, careful woman named Dr. Patricia Ames, called Nora directly rather than simply emailing a report. Dr. Ames explained, with the kind of controlled excitement Nora suspected didn't come naturally to someone in her field, that the survey had identified a substantial aquifer sitting almost entirely beneath Nora's property, one of the largest confirmed groundwater reserves discovered in that region in decades, fed by a deep geological formation that had, by sheer coincidence of property lines drawn generations earlier, ended up concentrated almost exclusively under this one abandoned 40-acre parcel. Nora sat with that information a long moment, thinking about her father's journal entry, about Grady Tolliver's failing well, and the whole county's spreading drought crisis, understanding slowly that whatever her father had known or guessed decades earlier had just been confirmed by professional equipment in a way that made his old cryptic note feel considerably less like sentiment and considerably more like a specific, remembered fact he'd simply never gotten the chance to properly explain to anyone. Word moved fast once Dr. Ames's firm filed the required documentation with the state, the way word tends to move whenever something valuable gets discovered in a county already suffering through a serious water shortage. Within 2 weeks, a regional water utility company sent representatives out to Nora's property, polite and professionally dressed men who spoke carefully about discussing options for accessing the reserve, mentioning figures large enough that Nora found herself needing to sit down partway through the conversation. She told them she'd need time to think, time to understand her actual rights and options before agreeing to anything, and the representatives left cordial business cards along with a promise to follow up soon. What followed that visit complicated things considerably more than Nora expected. County officials, apparently alerted to the discovery through the same filed documentation, began quietly exploring whether the severity of the ongoing drought and the public need for water access might justify claiming rights to the aquifer through eminent domain, treating Nora's private property discovery as a resource too significant for one individual to control during what local officials were now calling a genuine regional emergency. Nora heard about these discussions second-hand at first, through a sympathetic county clerk who'd known her father years earlier and felt Nora deserved some warning before anything became official, calling her one evening to say plainly that she ought to find herself a lawyer sooner rather than later. The formal notice arrived by certified mail on a Tuesday morning, roughly a month after Dr. Ames's initial call, informing Nora that the county intended to move forward with eminent domain proceedings to secure water rights to her property's aquifer for public use during the ongoing drought emergency, offering compensation that, once Nora read the specific figure listed, amounted to a small fraction of what the water utility representatives had originally discussed with her weeks earlier. Nora stood in her kitchen holding that notice, the same kitchen where she'd first read her father's journal entry months earlier, understanding now with complete clarity that discovering something valuable beneath a piece of land nobody else had wanted apparently came with its own entirely new set of problems, ones considerably more complicated than cracked soil and a broken well pump had ever been. She read the notice a second time, then a third, trying to find some detail in the fine print that might work in her favor, before setting it down on the same table where Grady Tolliver's warning about cursed dirt suddenly felt like the least of her concerns. Nora spent that first week after the notice arrived doing more research than she'd done in her entire accounting career, calling every lawyer within a 2-hour drive who listed water rights or eminent domain cases among their experience, and finding, discouragingly, that most either wanted retainers she couldn't afford or seemed doubtful about her odds against a county citing genuine public emergency. Several told her plainly, without much sympathy, that fighting a county government over a public necessity during an active drought was close to a losing proposition, no matter how the numbers looked on paper. It was her sister Callie, of all people, who found the lawyer who eventually took the case, a semi-retired attorney named Marcus Whitfield, who'd handled water disputes for decades before mostly stepping back from full-time practice, and who agreed to work on a reduced fee up front in exchange for a percentage of whatever settlement or agreement eventually resulted. Whitfield's strategy, once he reviewed Dr. Ames's full survey data, centered on a detail Nora hadn't fully appreciated herself: the sheer scale of the discovered reserve, once made public through the county's own filed documentation, was considerably larger and more valuable than typical eminent domain compensation formulas were designed to account for. He argued, formally and repeatedly, that seizing the water rights at the low compensation rate the county had initially offered would set a precedent grossly disproportionate to the resource's actual value, a legal argument that started gaining real traction once local news outlets picked up the story and public attention turned toward exactly how much money was potentially at stake. Grady Tolliver, of everyone Nora expected support from, showed up at her farmhouse one evening during that stretch, saying plainly that he owed her an apology for the cursed dirt comment, especially now that his own cattle were drinking water hauled in at his own expense, while her spring kept running steady the whole drought through. He'd started talking to other affected farmers around the county, he told her, gathering informal support for her case, since a lot of them had started quietly wondering whether the county's eagerness to seize her water had less to do with genuine emergency need and more to do with simply not wanting to pay a private landowner what the resource was actually worth. The eminent domain case dragged through hearings for nearly 4 months, public interest growing steadily as local reporters kept following the story, until the county, facing mounting pressure and an increasingly strong legal argument from Whitfield, withdrew its seizure proceedings entirely, rather than risk a court ruling that might force considerably higher compensation than they'd budgeted for. That withdrawal opened the door for Nora to negotiate directly with the regional water utility company instead, this time from a position of confirmed public leverage rather than quiet vulnerability. The final agreement Nora signed that autumn secured her water rights under a long-term extraction and supply contract, structured with upfront payments, ongoing royalties tied to actual usage, and infrastructure investment the utility would cover entirely, a deal that Whitfield estimated, conservatively, would be worth roughly $40 million to Nora over the life of the contract, once all components were properly accounted for. Nora sat in Whitfield's office, reading through the final paperwork, thinking about the $5,000 she'd nervously bid at that county auction, less than 2 years earlier, unable to fully reconcile that number with the one now sitting in front of her. She drove out to her father's old journal that same evening, the same worn leather book she'd found behind a water heater in a half-collapsed farmhouse closet, and read his cryptic entry one more time, the line about everybody judging land by what grew on top instead of what ran deep beneath it. Whatever surveying knowledge or old-fashioned instinct had led Walt Bennett to write that particular thought down decades earlier, Nora finally understood, sitting there with a contract worth more money than she'd ever expected to see in her lifetime, that her father had been entirely, quietly right about something nobody else in the county had ever bothered taking seriously. Nora still keeps that journal on her kitchen table, in the same farmhouse Grady Tolliver once called cursed, and she thinks of her father every time she looks out over the eastern spring that never stopped running. If this story reminded you that the thing everyone dismisses sometimes turns out to be exactly what saves you, stay with us and subscribe, because we've got more stories like Nora and Walt's about the wisdom that waits quietly underground until somebody finally digs deep enough to find it.